All right, folks, welcome to today's episode extra with Emily Grijalva. Thank you, Emily, for joining us today. Emily was good enough to join us for our conversation around how our schools do and do not support the needs of our LGBTQ youth. And she's been good enough to stick around and chat a little bit more with us about her work and just some of the really exciting things that she is up to as an educator, as a restorative justice coordinator, as a GSA advisor, and many other things on top of that, I'm sure. So Emily, you serve on the LA Unified LGBTQ Plus Resolution Task Force, which is an exciting title. Would love to learn a little bit more from you about the resolution and the work of the task force and what that means for schools, for educators, for communities here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, definitely. So the LGBTQ resolution was a very exciting time of organizing, rallying, and really pushing LUSD board members to commit to providing more resources for our LGBTQ students. And so, some of the demands were making sure that October was celebrated as LGBTQ History Month, that there would be more intentional selection process around history textbooks, including students, and making sure that it's more inclusive, providing more staff training on ways that they can support students, and also the gender-neutral restrooms. So there was definitely a list of items that we feel that if honored, students would feel a lot more supported. And so it passed, and all board members voted in favor. But for the past few years, we've been kind of struggling to make sure that it is being carried out. And there was a lot of just politics. So the original resolution was, supported by Ref Rodriguez. He's no longer on the board. So then it was like, okay. So then Kelly Gonis kind of stepped in. And so it's been, a little bit as far as the board side, a little difficult, but I mean, like I mentioned, they all voted in favor. And so the task force is many of us who are part of the organizing efforts. So it includes organizers from Latino Equality Alliance, from the GSA network. We have people that work for the district. We communicate with the office of the Out for Schools campaign, right, that is in LAUSD, and then just some other community members. And so we're trying to figure out what we can, what kind of structures or plan that we can, share out with schools and hopefully, kind of ensure that it does get carried out.
Yeah. And I can imagine both the double-edged sword, I don't know if that's the right metaphor, of excitement that we have this resolution and we have this momentum, but also the extent to which its impact relies upon the individual behaviors of thousands of people literally across our school system at over 1,000 or 1,000 or so schools, right, to actually make it mean what we want it to mean, right? And the perhaps long journey we still have to get to that place. So, thank you for your work on that front. And speaking of your work, you wear many hats at your school, one of which is being the GSA advisor. And I noticed in your, I think I saw this on your LinkedIn page, that you described the GSA as being the Gender and Sexuality Alliance. And GSA is definitely, a term that's been around for a while, and I think was, as far as I was aware, was kind of first coined as Gay Straight Alliance. Mm-hmm. And I know there's many schools across country that still refer to it as that. So I thought it was interesting, the new framing of that acronym, or new to me at least, framing of that acronym. So I'm wondering if you can both talk about that and talk about the work that the GSA does. And in 2020, many of our viewers might be people who haven't been in high school themselves for a while. What does it mean to have a GSA today?
Yeah, for sure. So you're right. It used to be known as the Gay Straight Alliance, but there was a shift even the GSA network decided to go with Gender and Sexuality Alliance because there's just so many more terms and ways that people are identifying beyond gay and straight that seemed very limiting to the spectrum or just the constellation of genders and sexualities that exist. And they actually last year changed it to genders and sexualities, plural, just to kind of acknowledge the changes and just the new ways that folks are identifying themselves. And so when we started, we knew that we wanted to call it Gender and Sexuality Alliance to kind of reflect that shift. And so I'm very fortunate that at least the way, I mean, GSAs are very different in multiple school sites, depending on the needs and the students that are a part of their GSAs. So when we started our GSA, it was really about building a safe and brave space. You know, we hadn't had a GSA at Mendes, and so it was really just starting. What does that mean? And luckily, GSA Network and Latino Equality Alliance provided resources, kind of like, you know, asking us to think about, like, what is the kind of, like, do we want leadership roles? How often are we going to meet? You know, and just kind of helping us think about the structure of the GSA. But the students that were in that GSA, really what they wanted that first year was like to build a family and a sense of community. And so that's what the first year was like. It was really about being loving and supportive to one another, and we did everything together. Like we would go out to, and for me, I kind of do feel like I have an organizing background, and I always want to remind students that yes, the classroom is sacred and our safe space, but we also want to always venture out to the community and look at the resources that exist. And students are going to graduate, and I want them to know that there's other organizations that they can intern, work, and like seek out once they graduate from GSA. And so so we would go to, like, you know, we went to Pride together. It was like my first Pride too. We would go to like an LGBTQ literary conference. We would go to, we went to go see Love, Simon together. Like it was a lot of like us going out and going to these spaces that they were interested in, but kind of nervous. So when you go together as a collective, you know, it was just a way to bond and grow. And so we formed a very tight knit circle. And so we cried together, we shared, we supported each other, especially students that were going through their own coming out journeys. So that was kind of like year one, was like, how do we build community? And then the second year was like, okay, we love each other, and now we want to like change, you know, the system. So that's when we did the gender neutral campaign, and it was more like, how are we gonna actually like push teachers to be more inclusive? We met with admin, you know, so it was like definitely a very like activist year two. But then we kind of felt like we lost a little bit of the community building. So then we're like, okay, year three, we gotta have a balance, right? So, and that's something that we've strived to have now, like make sure that we're having the community moments where we're, sometimes we'll just watch Queer Eye together or like Drag Race and just hang out or go to events together. And then other times we're also pushing for change. So for me, I feel like that's the best, like having both. Yeah. And there's some students who choose not to participate in the activist area because they're really there just because they want support, and that's okay. Or there's some that would rather just be out in the streets and don't necessarily want to like share. And, you know, I always make sure that they're leading and that they're deciding how they show up and participate. So I'm kind of like flexible with their needs.
Yeah. Yeah. So you, I know, I have often seen your posts online, I guess I should say, and your, you know, in your bio, we introduce you as, you know, the proud daughter of Central American, or, you know, from a proud Central American family. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how your identity intersects with your work as an educator, and maybe the extent to which that also has drawn you to doing this work as a restorative justice coordinator, as a GSA advisor, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely impacts my philosophy and like my commitment to education. So I had a very interesting educational journey because so I was born in LA, grew up in the Echo Park area, but then my mom actually wanted us to avoid public school education and sent us to Guatemala to go study over there. And so I attended an international school, and it was English only. we were not allowed to speak Spanish. We learned mostly American history, American literature. All our teachers were American and Canadian. So when we would do the anthem, right?
That's
when there was a graduation, we would do the Guatemalan anthem, the American anthem, the Canadian anthem. And there was one time where we had like the Mexican ambassadors kit, so we also had to do the Mexican anthem. It was a very long graduation.
Wow. Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting because originally the school was built to serve the kids of missionaries out in Guatemala, and then they opened it up to the community, and it was now predominantly Guatemalan students. But it almost had still like kind of, now that I reflect, like I was like, oh, that was like still kind of colonizing mentality, like the fact that I served detention for being caught speaking Spanish, and things like that, and
that
so a lot of times, when I tell
Yeah.
people I went to school in Guatemala, they assumed I went to like a Guatemalan Spanish speaking school, but no,
Right.
like it was basically an American school situated in Guatemala, and so even though I grew up in Guatemala, when I went to college in the United States and I returned, I remember sitting in a sociology class, and she put in a documentary, and it talked about the Guatemalan genocide. And I remember blushing and almost feeling like ashamed that I did not know my history. And when it finished, it was break time, and I went and I called my mom, and I was like, why did I not know this? Like, how, like, this is such a big deal about our history. And my mom's like, well, we just don't talk about it. And I was just like, and I cried, and I was just so outraged. And I almost felt like I had been betrayed by my schooling system. Like, I'm like, how did I go throughout my whole educational system and not know anything about myself? And then it totally, as many of us when we go to college, we like try to find ourselves, right? And so I was like, I don't know Guatemalan authors. Now I have to go like, and I kind of pushed myself into really learning about Guatemalan history and literature and current events, and and now I'm like super involved in the Guatemalan community in LA, and have done other kind of like outside community projects, but and I remember that feeling so well. And so when I decided to become a teacher, it was because of that. Like, I was like, I don't want anybody to feel that, to like come graduate 12th grade and be like, I don't know anything about myself. And I think that transfers well to the work that I've been doing in GSA, because it's the same thing. Like that quote that you mentioned, right? I would hate for a student to have passed and gone through my class and been like, I didn't get to explore myself. I didn't get to see myself in the literature or the articles that my teacher selected. And it does take a lot of work, because I have to be mindful of like not only their like sexuality and gender, but am I also including like our Central American students, our Mexican students, and just trying to include a lot of their own identities in my classroom. But I think it boils down to remembering sitting there in that classroom and feeling like I don't know myself, and I'm like barely, and I'm learning this in college. I'm thinking of my peers that didn't make it to college, and so that is definitely what I think got me into teaching, and definitely I can relate to some of my students where they feel that they're not visible in the classroom. And then the second piece is that with the Guatemalan genocide and the Civil War, right, in the 90s when I was in like about elementary, I'm like, am I aging myself? I totally am, but that was when they signed.
Not on this stage.
Okay.
I'm with you.
There was the peace accords were signed in Guatemala, and that did not necessarily mean peace. Like there was still not infrastructure, and there was still a lot of violence that, like I mentioned, I was seeing and I knew about, but our parents and teachers were not talking about it, And there was a lot of racism towards indigenous folks, and it was just like all these issues that would have, should have been addressed in the classroom, but weren't. And so then fast forward, I'm now a teacher in Bow Heights. I'm at a middle school where there's very punitive practices in place, and where deans are like yelling at kids that are like half their size. And I just felt very torn, because I knew that that's not how I wanted to treat students. And I know now, thanks to restorative justice, there's been a push, but I was told don't smile at students, be super strict. They'll like walk all over you. And it wasn't the case. I mean, they're 13. I was teaching 7th grade. And, but I think that also my identity of understanding, treating folks with peace and dignity and know that it takes a lot of work, like that also kind of piqued my interest into restorative justice and wanting to know that we don't have to criminalize our students, that we can provide safe spaces for them. And so that's kind of where I started my journey too.
Yeah. I mean, that is quite a story, Emily. I did not know that's what I was going to hear when I asked that question, but I feel like, so born in LA, schooled in Guatemala,
yes.
but at an American school
yes.
where you learned mostly about American culture, and then wind up teaching in LA, where we are now. I mean, I know many of our schools. I'm not 100% sure about it at Mendez, but are receiving a lot of students now. Mm-hmm. Unaccompanied 15-year-old minors, yes. and things, right, who are coming to LA because of the ripple effect of the very history you were just naming, right? There's yes. like a book or a screenplay or something in there that you should write, Emily.
But I know, and I've always tried to include Central American history in my classroom too, and my Mexican American students, our Mexican students appreciate it too, because they're seeing it in the news. And unfortunately right now there's tension between Mexicans and Central Americans, which is devastating because of the current immigration policies. Yeah. And so the students are hearing about it. They're hearing their families talk about it. So it's important that they understand, why are folks coming specifically from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So we would have units about that too, and then for the few little pockets of Central Americans, they appreciated it too. They're like, oh, you're Guatemalan? I'm like, yes, I am. A few Central Americans in Boyle Heights, we kind of stick together.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Emily, that is fascinating. And again, I just want to thank you for being with us today, for sharing, your work and your story with our audience. And folks, if you enjoyed what you heard today, you can see our full episode with Emily and, of course, all of our content on our website, which is aotashow.com. And we would be greatly appreciative if you would like this post, share it with people who might also find it interesting, and might want to learn more about the amazing work happening in our field, in schools here in LA and across this country. So thank you for joining us today. Again, find all of our content at aotashow.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.